Hello, my name is Philip Blair.
Hi, this is Matt Berkowitz here.
Krause here
For Freethought Friday.
You're listening to Freethought Friday.
For Freethought Friday.
When you are studying any matter or considering any philosophy, ask yourself only what are the facts and what is the truth that the facts bear out.
Science is more than a body of knowledge. It's a way of thinking, a way of skeptically interrogating the universe. If we are not able to ask skeptical questions, to be skeptical of those in authority, then we're up for grabs.
In all of science, we're looking for a balance between data and theory. You don't have to delude yourself with Iron Age fairy tales.
The same spiritual fulfillment that people find in religion can be found in science by coming to know, if you will, the mind of God.
The real world, as it actually is not evil. It's remarkable. And the way to understand the physical world is to use science.
There is a new wave of reason sweeping across America, Britain, Europe, Australia, South America, the Middle East and Africa. There is a new wave of reason where superstition had a firm hold. Teach a man to reason, and he'll think for a lifetime. Think for a lifetime.
Hello, Internet, and welcome to episode 206 of Freethought Friday with your usual host, Ciarán O'Flynn. Unfortunately, Rob could be with me today. He's busy preparing for another gig. But instead, we have a guest with us today, Phil Blair, who's come down from Belfast.
Hey.
Thanks very much, Phil, for joining us. And you're going to have a chat with us about pseudoscience?
Well, just a sort of a general discussion about pseudoscience, skepticism, and denialism, which is something you hear quite a lot about. You know, things like global warming denialism and vaccination denialism, and basically the sort of general tactics that people use who essentially deny evidence. That's, you know, denialists sort of live up their term in the sense that they're very motivated by confirmation bias, and they just tend to only like look at things that back up what they think and just essentially reject evidence, more or less. So yeah,
right. Excellent. I think it's going to be very interesting. As you said, there's lots of areas where denialism is particularly prevalent. Recently, I think, ongoing, of course, is the question over climate change, stroke global warming, and we'll definitely have a chat about that. Vaccines have been in the news, in particular in the American news, recently, so we should definitely have a chat about that. I suppose we should clarify, I mean, there's denialism and then there's confirmation bias. Yeah. And I think we're all guilty, if we even want to use those kind of words, of confirmation bias. Yeah. I have it, you have it. In science, the scientific method recognizes that the bias is inherent, and in fact, with the best will of the world, we can't really get away from it. So we try to use things like peer review to try and balance it out and maybe even get rid of it if we can. But denialism seems to be a good bit stronger. It's not just even a subconscious desire to only look at the data that you want to look at. There seems to be a very fervent, I'm on this path and I'm only going to go on this path.
Yeah, well, like denialists, they almost take the position of like a lawyer almost, you know, instead of like in science, you're obviously looking to reassess your views with new evidence, whereas denialists, they just sort of pick a side and basically just cherry pick certain information. So like, in my opinion, like denialism, I think they kind of start out with the position that either the scientific community as a whole is corrupt or media is corrupt. So then they basically retreat into often untestable positions, and they basically use various tactics. Which, do you want me to go into this now?
Yeah,
okay, so
yeah.
So just to give to begin with, I mean, if you take something like, say, global warming denialism, a lot of people in this sort of climate skeptic community, they tend to really reject the word. They think denialism is almost like an ad hominem attack, because they often get sort of conflated with Holocaust deniers, and they think, well, you know, why are you comparing us to those? But the reason why we're not sort of saying that they're morally equivalent to Holocaust deniers. What we're saying is they use a set of tactics that are sort of universal to all people who and that just goes for like AIDS denialists. And so to give an example, one of them would obviously be, as I said earlier, confirmation bias. And confirmation bias is essentially when people selectively expose themselves to information that already backs up what they think. So in that respect, it sort of works the opposite way as from science, because as you were saying earlier, like science is essentially whenever you start out with an observation, and then you form a hypothesis, and then you make a prediction, and then you test that, you test that out, and then based on the results, you get other people to try to reproduce your work, and from that you can determine, over a long period of time, you can determine whether or not this actually has, more accuracy based on if it can be falsified, or if you test something long enough and it stands up to rigorous scrutiny, then it's more likely to be true. Whereas confirmation bias sort of works backwards, because essentially you're starting out with the conclusion, and then you're just cherry picking, usually just clinging quite desperately to any little bits of information that you can find to back it up, essentially. So, do you want to expand?
No, yeah. Well, no, I think that's a great explanation of the two. It interests me in relation to denialism. So, as you described there, actually, there's two very different thoughts of process operating. One is seeking to identify what is happening, and one is seeking purely, it would seem, to just back up what they already assumed was happening. Yeah,
well, I mean, it takes like, to give an example, like I was talking to like a global warming denier once, and I'm just going to give an example of just how like silly it is. Like I was he posted this newspaper article basically saying, the Met Office admits global warming is a hoax, essentially, and this is in the Daily Mail. I mean, have you read the Daily Mail? Have you heard of the Daily Mail?
I know the Daily Mail, but I haven't read anything about the particular hoax.
It's pretty.
Well, actually, sorry, I am aware of one particular story. I think I saw it through a Horizon report, and this was from a while ago, and it was to do with some data that was released by a particular office. Studying. That's not the one you're talking about, is it?
Well, I'll get into that in a minute.
You get into that,
there's that as well, but then that's basically the same as this. But basically, they'll basically release articles saying, the Met Office admits, no warming in 15 years, and so I'll obviously kind of look at that and say, well, that's kind of a big claim to make, because the Met Office up until now has been pretty, for the idea that, anthropogenic global warming is happening. So what I do is I would just go to their actual official way. This is the Met Office supposedly saying this. How about we just go to the actual Met Office website and see if this is true? And whenever you go to the Met Office website, there's the first blog will be, response to Daily Mail article, and it'll basically just be detailing, we had this email exchange with this journalist, and here's where they took us out of context, and here's where they misrepresented data, and then so I'll post that article in this. We're talking about like Facebook here. I'll post that article to like a Facebook comment, and instead of just taking that on and saying, look, here's the Met Office saying that this article is essentially bullshit, they'll just go, oh no, it's just a big conspiracy, and so that gets to the heart of what confirmation bias is. They believe the Met Office when the Daily Mail incorrectly claims the Met Office is saying something in their position, but whenever the Met Office themselves say no, that's wrong, then they won't accept that. So you sort of see just how silly it, or just how motivated reasoning, it's just really irrational. It doesn't make any sense. And
actually, that motivated reasoning is a very interesting question, because I think there are definitely people who deny because they have a vested interest in maybe a different outcome or a different result. But there does seem to be, I don't know if it's the majority of denialists, probably don't have a particular vested interest, as in maybe not an economic interest or a particularly huge economic interest, but they may of course have a psychological or emotionally vested interest in a particular idea that they have. But would you say that's the case? Would you say, is it mostly the CEOs of petrol companies that have a problem, or is it actually mostly just people who aren't thinking scientifically? They are thinking in a denialist kind of way.
I think it's a combination of both, because I actually give global warming deniers often the benefit of the doubt, because like there was a study I read one time by a guy called Dan Cahan, I believe his name was. I could be wrong there, but he did like a study. He's like a professor at Yale University or something, and he showed that most people who reject global warming, the science for global warming, they're always often, you know, rugged individualists who are essentially pro free market, and they're basically against any kind of progressive taxation or pretty much anything that interferes with the market that tries to limit the destructive actions of economic externalities. So no, I would agree. There's definitely, at least 99% of the time, there has to be some sort of economic or political motivation. But as you were saying earlier about CEOs, like, yeah, there's obviously that aspect, because in the global warming, if we take, say, the global warming debate, if we look at, say, the science, I mean, since about 1991, like, something like 98% of peer-reviewed published papers all sort of basically agree that yes, global warming's happening, and our carbon dioxide emissions, our greenhouse gas emissions in general, and things like deforestation, they're pretty much the main cause. So that, and then they're also echoed by all the, you know, reputable scientific organizations like, you know, like NASA or the American Advancement for the Association of Science or the IPCC. So that's basically our side. But then the denial science is usually predominantly funded by people such as, you know, well, they come out as front groups. So you have, there's a front group, like, it has like a really inconspicuous name called the Friends of Science. And
I've heard of them. Yes, yeah. It's Friends of Science.
Yeah, so it's just really inconspicuous name, but like
the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like so they'll come out and say they'll basically act like they're sort of like a group of like concerned scientists who are, you know, really worried about the global warming alarmists and things of that nature, and then they're basically almost like they're an astroturf. You know what an astroturf movement is?
No.
Astroturf is kind of a play on the word grassroots. You know, grassroots is obviously when ordinary people get together and they're trying to make change, whereas astroturf is something that comes under the impression that it's grassroots, but in actual fact, if you sort of backtrack the funding, like things like Friends of Science, they're funded by groups like the Heartland Institute and the Cato Institute and the George C. Marshall Institute, who are all basically free market economic think tanks who are basically, their entire purpose is they're there to basically promote free market economics. And then if you backtrack them, then they're funded by like ExxonMobil and you know, the Koch brothers and all these big, and so, and the reason obviously why they're doing that is because if the Koch brothers or the ExxonMobil came out and said, well, we have scientists, then that would obviously, people would obviously see through that. But if you gave the impression that, you know, here's a group of concerned citizens that are, you know, fighting for our rights, our economic rights, then that sort of, you know, that gives the impression that these are just people on their side rather than just being funded by, you know, elitists essentially, who are looking to perpetuate their power and oil interests.
Yeah, I think that's so that's interesting. I was wondering. I honestly thought that maybe the number of those with economic interests, vested interest in denying this, would have been maybe smaller, and that it might have been just a larger group of, maybe, as you said, rugged individualists. But actually, I mean, I certainly knew from a funding point of view that it's more likely funding would come from those. But that's so you actually reckon, no, the vested interests definitely are there. Sometimes they're a little bit more hidden than we realise because of these kind of funding.
The thing is, as well, people could turn around to me as well and say, well, you're a leftist, so how do we know that you're not being biased? But because the thing about global warming as well is, like, the reason why I think it's especially such a politically contentious issue is because it was actually introduced to the world primarily through Al Gore's documentary, The Inconvenient Truth. And so a lot of people would look to Al Gore and say, well, you know, what's he got to gain from that? You know, it'd be different if like someone like Stephen Hawking or Neil deGrasse Tyson did it, but like if he's coming out, you know, obviously the Republicans, and they're obviously saying, or I know I'm using American terms here, but like the Republican or general conservatives will be saying, well, what does he have to gain from this? And then they would actually pull out their own arguments and say, well, you know, Al Gore basically owns a company called Generation Investment Management, and they're basically a big company that promotes things like carbon credits and things like this, and apparently he probably gets some money from it as well. But then, so a lot of people would probably put that argument forward as well. But then where I've come to is like I actually just analyze the evidence rather. I don't really take vested. I do acknowledge that there's vested interests in and conflicts of interest within science, but I'm personally just more interested in what the actual arguments are, and I think if more people just sort of boil down to what the facts are rather than worrying about what the politics are, people would obviously have a more informed opinion about it, So.
And in fact, that's an interesting one, that because you were talking about the science and potentially people arguing about scientists being bought off on whatever side of this particular argument that people might think that's happening. Of course, scientists as people can always be bought off. In fact, almost all of us have our price. For any billionaires listening out there, mine is 1.379 billion. But very specific. But I know what I want. But as you said, there's a difference, because I have had people say this to me. They said, "Oh, well, you can find scientists that says X is true." Well, I'm sure I could find a scientist that says X is not true, or that it's opposite, or not, or Y is true. And as you were saying, if we try to separate even the scientists from the science, the actual the evidence that we've gathered, the evidence that's been tested and peer reviewed, and for which you said there's a 98% consensus on?
Since the amount of papers published since 1981, there's 90, but then obviously it really depends. Like the IPCC would say, well, we're about 96%, pretty much convinced. And then if you actually just take climate scientists as a whole, then it's 97%. So but either way, it's just an overwhelming majority of people that agree, or experts that agree.
And it's actually happening, and we're a central cause of it, if not.
And then the thing is, because a lot of people would obviously point to the fact that maybe it just seems extremely unlikely that amount of scientists would propagate. They would basically spend their entire career trying to propagate this fallacy. Essentially, it just seems pretty unlikely.
But there are definitely people who argue that, and in fact, we call them generally science denialists. Whereas they're not necessarily denying a particular thing like climate change or whatever else, but they're actually denying that science. Well, actually, can you explain what a science denialist is? I have an idea of what I think it is. I think a science denialist is someone who actually denies the scientific method, but actually, I'm sure they probably are maybe wouldn't describe it as that. Would you?
I mean, a denialist is just someone who essentially just employs like rhetorical techniques to basically disguise the fact they don't have any evidence, essentially, and it's as I said earlier, it's people who essentially, they never really take on board what you're saying either. They're not really, they're people who are just motivated by putting across their point of view, and they have no real interest in sort of trying to reject their claim. I mean, that's the only way. I'm using denialist in a really literal sense there. That people, I mean, I've kind of got to a point now where I don't really debate denialists on the facts anyway. I mean, I think we were talking about this earlier about how it's more important to get people to think about their thought process rather than, because if you just debate people on the facts, they very rarely, I mean, in the past 5 or 6 years, I've probably convinced about like 3 people, but but most people just, they never really embrace new models of thinking. They tend to just, retreat into untestable positions, and you just never get through to them like 99% of the time.
And do you know what, that is a shockingly depressing statistic.
I mean, I'm not. That's not literally. That's just in my experience.
Your experience, and that's you've been at this an awful lot longer than I have, and to think that I, as you said, we were talking about this earlier on, and I think that is the case. I think I've become quite frustrated. I've reached that level that I think most people like yourself have reached a long time ago, that when trying to talk to people and see if they'll change their mind, they generally don't on the ideas. And of course, in trying to analyse why, it's the same problem that was there a few years ago or a few months ago when I first engaged with whoever I engaged with, and it is the thought process has not moved at all, or if it has moved, it's only moved a slight bit, not enough for them to actually go beyond. And so, again, we were discussing this earlier, I think it's perhaps less useful to talk about outcomes and more useful to talk about process, but most people want to engage with you on the outcome, on the debate around climate change, or the debate about evolution, or the debate about vaccines or whatever. Actually, do you want to, well, I don't want to go off the climate change one because, sorry, I've noticed you were saying global warming, which it was the phrase I always used. I'm using climate change now because I have noted, I don't know if it was you who pointed out to me or someone pointed out to me that officially they changed the name because
no,
you didn't point this out. So
well, no, I'm just saying no in general, like they didn't change.
They didn't change it.
Global warming and climate change are essentially interchangeable, and climate change has been used like since the 50s or so, or probably even earlier than that. Like
interesting.
It's global warming is just the average global temperatures rising, and then global warming causes climate change. It's an argument I don't really understand. Like a lot of people in the conservative right seem to use this argument a lot, and I don't really understand. They seem to think this is almost like a real, like, you know, what's the word I'm looking for? Like what's the word for a shot? Like a they seem to think it's a good argument.
Yeah, like a takedown argument.
Yeah,
and it's enough to end the conversation.
And just kind of sitting there going, no. I mean, the IPCC has been around like since the 80s, you know. So, but I don't know. No, it's just a stupid argument.
No, it's cool. It's brilliant. I think I picked this up only recently, and I think it was from an article I read. So, which shows you, I decided to just trust the article without fact checking it at all. But the point that the author of the argument was making was, it's not that global warming isn't happening, it most certainly is. This person was in complete agreement with the scientific consensus on it. But I think the argument he was making was, because people don't understand global warming and climate change, and they think they do, or they make ridiculous arguments like, well, sure, the planet isn't heating up, or sure, wasn't there a hot summer last year, that he's argued that people that the public reporting of this, especially by those who are convinced this is real, has started to shift towards the term climate change because they feel, in the minds of those who don't understand what's going on anyway, they won't get confused with you know, if climate change means that, you know, we might precipitate an ice age or something like that they wouldn't. I agree with you that it's almost a political decision. Like it's very light end of the political decision, but it's like, oh, we have to get this right in order to get people on our side. Whereas if we're looking at the data, who the hell cares what we call it? It's an effect. I mean, we can predict the negative impact of it, and it's a problem we need to deal with, you know?
Yeah, I mean, we just know, I mean, obviously, like the history of climate change, I mean, do you know much about the history?
I don't, no.
I mean,
no.
we just know that carbon dioxide is a heat-trapping gas. That's pretty much a fact. Now, people always, this is another argument you get from climate deniers, will say, well, carbon dioxide is essential for life. You know, we need carbon dioxide. You know, we wouldn't be here without carbon dioxide, and that's true.
So a little carbon dioxide, good. Yeah, I mean, a lot of carbon dioxide, fabulous.
I mean, if obviously if you take something like the moon, for example, like moon, if we didn't have any carbon dioxide or any kind of greenhouse gases at all, our planet would be basically dead and lifeless like the moon. But then on the other side of the argument, if you look at, say, a planet like Venus, Venus has like a runaway greenhouse effect, which makes it essentially hostile towards life. So what separates, the good thing about Earth is Earth has almost like a natural carbon cycle where carbon is like basically reused and recycled throughout the biosphere essentially. So what the problem is not so much that it's more we're emitting carbon dioxide faster that can be reabsorbed by the planet, because there's stuff like deforestation as well, which is also contributes to it as well. So but this has been, I mean, there's a scientist called Svante Arrhenius, I think he was called. He's like a Swedish scientist. Like he more or less theoretically put forward that, you know, the burning of industrial age coal could theoretically warm the planet in like the early 1900s or something like that. And obviously, because like, obviously global warming back in the day, like there was a 50-50 debate at one point, but over time it's just reached a consensus because all the other things like global dimming or global cooling, they've just all been inconsistent with what the data showed. So over time we've just got this consensus where, you know, carbon dioxide is a heat trapping gas, human beings emit carbon dioxide, therefore, you know, we're trapping heat.
Yeah, we're trapping heat, absolutely. And so the other thing that interests me in relation to this discussion is, and I feel the same actually in relation to nuclear power. So maybe we can actually have a chat. I don't know. Do you know anything about?
Not overly. No, I'm not really too.
So I have a couple of ideas on this. And
but for the record, I would consider myself pretty pro nuclear in a way. I mean, I don't really take the sort of green position that the green position, but I would take like renewable energy, like wind power, and those are good as well. But like, if you take something like France, for example, I believe France, a good majority of their energy is nuclear. I mean, I could be wrong there. Is that
I don't know,
yeah.
but do you know, we'll find out.
Yeah, well, apparently, like they're one of like the least emitters of carbon dioxide, which is just a good thing. Obviously, nuclear energy is obviously pretty good there.
Sure.
And so
let's definitely have a chat about that. And so, in fact, I'm gonna kind of move into that.
Yeah.
I don't want this to be just about
global warming.
Energy. Well, even just about global warming, but I don't want it to be just about energy. But but I think it is somewhat relevant in that, as you said, as you very eloquently demonstrated, all of the data we have suggests that there's an awful lot more carbon in the system now, especially in the last 100 and plus years, which we can trace back to the beginning of us burning fossil fuels at high rates. And then it's us that are burning them. There's no other life forms that we know that are doing this on the planet, and there's no other mechanism that can as neatly explain, as you said, Occam's razor. The simplest explanation here is that it's the humans who are burning the carbons and entering them into the system. So even if the answers, or even if retorts given by whoever were along the lines of, well, we're not 100% certain that it's humans. Yeah. But you know what? We're pretty certain. And it's not 50% certain. We're 95% certain, 99, 98% certain. Surely it makes sense that irrespective of whether we're definitely doing damage, I'd almost appeal to Pascal's wager, and I wouldn't ordinarily do that, but I'd almost appeal to it in this case, in that surely at this point it would do less harm, despite the potential economic ramifications for some people. It would do less harm for us to actually err on the side of caution, whereas for us to assume that this isn't the case, or to wait until we had 100% confirmation, which probably never come until maybe giant floods or whatever, that it would make sense for us to go down the path of, let's just go and do it. Now, I know, I'm sure there are plenty of people who might argue against that, but I think that's also one of the important things here, that looking at the data, we're never going to get 100%. So that's not the way science works. So we're never going to get that certainty that people seem to want, or at least they seem to want when it is something that they're not particularly happy with. With the nuclear power question, I don't know enough about. I mean, obviously, the concerns of the past. There were two, I think, main ones. Obviously, there was the waste, the radioactive waste, and the potential damage that a meltdown could do. And there's a couple of examples of the kind of damage that meltdowns have done. But the arguments more recently have been that we can deal with the waste a lot better right now. Like significant, as I understand, significantly better, from things that were radioactive for 30,000 years to we're getting it down to 100 or something like that. Or I don't understand the science. My issue with this, though, has been the same in relation to the climate change question, in that, okay, that's fine, but isn't the burning of fuel still a finite resource? And if it's limited, I'm not saying that means we shouldn't use it. I'm just saying it's in no way a solution at all, because we're still... So if coal and oil and gas didn't produce all the kind of negative consequences, I would still argue that we should be moving towards renewables or something like that, because it's just not long-term sustainable. So in fact, it's sustainability.
I mean, global warming is not the only. I mean, just stuff like biodiversity loss and peak. Well, I'm a bit sort of a skeptic of peak oil as a concept, but we're obviously we can't just be using all the oil like just within the next few decades. Essentially,
well, I mean, it is finite. We all know it. It's not going to. We can't bring it back, and well, not yet anyway. But so I mean, to me, the argument, all the political arguments, all the economic arguments aside, to me, and even if the debate was 50-50, I would still be going, well, it still makes more sense to move in this direction. It's logical, it's rational, it's sustainable. I kind of feel the same in relation to the nuclear power argument, irrespective of whether or not Because there's a limited amount of uranium-235 and there isn't plutonium as well. I can't remember which one is. I think it's the plutonium one actually that's mostly used in reactors rather than the uranium. But anyway, I'm sure someone will correct me on that.
I mean, the thing about nuclear as well. Or sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna say it's a limited fuel. So even if all of the issues surrounding safety or whatever else were taken care of, I'd still go. Yeah, I wouldn't waste my time doing it, but if the science is, I would certainly have been on the nuclear is evil. We don't go near it. Why not? Oh, I don't know. I was told by that guy in the 80s or 90s. So I've definitely changed my mind on that as new information has been presented. But I would make the argument that it's just not sustainable. So I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying.
See, nuclear, I think for me personally is probably more. It's more of a time issue because I just don't think when it comes to like things like solar and wind. You know, I'm not really as educated on what the crack is there, but it's whether or not, to me, nuclear fission is probably the best thing we have at the moment for dealing with global warming in the sense that and I'd say another good thing as well about nuclear is because if you take something like wind energy usually it's usually dispersed over a wide area, which in itself is kind of like an environmental issue because you have stuff like land use, which is which basically affects biodiversity because you're using up like way more land than whereas if you just use nuclear, you're just doing it in a very smaller land base essentially. So it's its footprint on the land is much smaller than there's definitely arguments that can be made that I think those who would know better about this than I would are probably right in relation to the time issue. So I'd agree with that. Once again, as well, if we look at the climate scientists, a lot of climate scientists would actually be very pro-nuclear. They seem to think that, and once again, I know this is sort of an appeal to authority in a way, but like they seem to think that nuclear is pretty much a mandatory part of the effort, essentially. According to them, anyway.
It may be a stopgap measure. Do you know what? We should put a call out to our 11 podcast fans. If there is a nuclear fission expert or a nuclear fission energy expert out there who wants to enlighten us further on us, that would be great. I'll leave. I don't know if I've mentioned this on the podcast, but I'll leave us maybe with one last one on this. Something I always say, but it's not an answer to nuclear fission or an answer to anything, but it is just something that I'm fascinated about. And that is the ITER project. Have you heard of the ITER project?
No.
Right. I like telling people about the ITER project because I was absolutely shocked when I heard that this was being done. Shocked in a very positive way that I heard when this was done. So ITER, which is Latin apparently for the way, but which, if you look at the Wikipedia page, which gives a bit of history to it, actually was initially an acronym which stood for International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor. Is a project predominantly sponsored by, I think, the European Union or certainly European countries, maybe in the EEA or one of the EU plus more countries. China is on board, Japan and Russia and the US. And essentially what it is an attempt for humanity to create its first nuclear fusion reactor. And it's in the reactor is being built, or it's almost I'm not sure if it's complete. It obviously isn't complete because it's not going online until 2019, but it's being built, I think, somewhere in the south of France. And the guy who directed CERN for the last 30 years is now the director of that particular project. It looks like a fascinating project. They have been very realistic on their timelines. The reactor is to demonstrate the feasibility of the materials that we have at the moment and to see if they can sustain a particular reaction. They hope to generate a demo reactor called Demo in 2024. And then if all of those work, maybe by 2032, they think they'll have a nuclear fusion reactor actually adding to the grid. But rather than this being a cold fusion, this is what I thought this was initially. My skeptic hat went on because I was trying to also fit over it my tinfoil hat. Because I was wondering, is this a thing? And it's not. It's actually it's hot fusion. It's not cold fusion. What they're doing is they're trying to build a regulated plasma reaction within a torus, and it's actually based on science that was eventually released after the fall of the Iron Curtain, in inverted commas, stuff that the apparently Russian physicists were working on in the 70s didn't get. they got further than scientists in the West got on, but didn't get too much further. No information was published. It was never given out to anyone, and it was only taken up then by some UK scientists, I think, in the 80s and 90s. So it's a very, very interesting idea. I agree with you that I don't think it would be ready in time for us to probably replace that step. We probably still need to look at something like fission. But I do like to say to people, you mean nuclear fission, not fusion. We're almost there, or fusion. I don't know if we're almost there, but it's perhaps hopeful. Anyway, so I don't know. Yeah. I'll put the link to that. iter.org, I think, is the website. So it's interesting. I check in with them every now and again to see what new videos they have. So the science denialism thing, I think, is interesting, because there seems to be... I saw a very interesting program, I think it was Horizon documentary, about the history of how science became the bad boy. And it actually may not have even been Horizon, you know what? I actually think it was a series done by Professor Brian Cox. Oh, okay. It was one of a series after the Wonders of the Universe. And basically, he was tracing... in the mid to 1800s, science had a very, very positive PR perception. Generally, with the public, it was very well liked. It was considered amazing. We were inventing lots of very, very, very cool things at the time, and discovering lots of very interesting things. And there was a general openness towards science. And then something seemed to happen from the late 1800s up to probably the dropping of the first atomic bomb. And of course, some of those things are very obvious. But even there was some attention drawn to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And there's some arguments that even at that time, the culture was beginning to change. In fact, that book was popular because it was appealing to a kind of science is interfering with natural laws kind of mentality. So it's unfortunate that we haven't come out of that. I get a sense we might be beginning to come out of that. When I say we haven't come out of it, there's still a significant portion of the population who seem to be very, I don't want to say skeptical about science, cynical about science. As a methodology, maybe it's through lack of understanding or whatever, but they certainly don't consider it to be a great gift to humanity in any way. They seem to consider it as susceptible to corruption as, say, an evil oil company or whatever. I'm sure there are good oil companies out there too. But
I would say,
no, I was going to say, is that something? Do you think that too, or
I think a big problem as well is the fact that to me it's more the media's fault. You know, if you look at, say, like, I'm just giving an example. You know, like the MMR vaccine scare, like. We could sit and sort of blame, you know, the Andrew Wakefield's paper and say, well, this is just really bad science. But then, to me, it's more the fact that the media, basically, because of their sort of commitment to non-story or controversial stories, you know, or the sort of tendency to give two equal sides, you know, for the sense of debate, essentially, or for the sense of
the media is biased in favor of balance.
Yeah, it's what's called, there's a term called false equivalency, which is basically the idea that. You basically, you know, you bring like the peer-reviewed science, and then you bring somebody else who quite often they aren't even really an expert. Like, coming back to the global warming thing again, you know, like a lot of people who come out and debate the climate scientists are people like there's a guy called, you know, Christopher Monckton. Have you heard of him?
I've heard the name.
Yeah, so he's like he's part of like the political party UKIP, and like he has absolutely no scientific. He claims he was like a science advisor to Margaret Thatcher, but then if you actually look into it, he wasn't. He was like an economic advisor, but for some reason he basically he's the one. We have the peer-reviewed science on the side, and then he's Christopher Monckton and a whole bunch of other non-experts, you know, mathematicians or geographers, people who seem to think that their opinions equally valid, and so. I had a point that was going to this, but then I just lost it.
But that the media and its reporting of stories for the sake of controversy.
Yeah, but then because I actually debated with someone about this recently, about how you know we should always give equal sides and let other people come to the decision. But then when it comes to things like public health or environmental degradation, I think. Coming back to what you were saying earlier, most people don't understand science. Most people, if you say something like peer review process, most people don't even know what the peer review process is. So, to me, it's the media's job to basically give people an informed decision about these topics that you know, and make them sort of comprehensible to people who obviously read newspapers. But then that's that just doesn't make interesting tabloid newspaper.
No, it doesn't sell papers.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that is I would have had the same view in relation to media as you do. And unfortunately, the reality is, of course, because most media organizations are businesses operating within a business model, then sex sells, controversy sells, and
often as well,
emotion sells.
We have to remember that they're obviously owned by people who have also political interests. Like, what do you call him? Rupert Murdoch. He's pretty right wing.
A little, just a little, maybe just slightly more right wing.
So a lot of his media would promote like global warming denialism or denialism in general. So
as you said, we're back to the vested interest. Yeah. They're definitely vested interest. I mean, I suppose it is wonderful to see that, and maybe I'm just seeing it because I'm looking for it. There seems to be a moderate increase of interest in science and how science works, and because science is generating some amazing stories, and not without evidence, not just making up stories. It's actually the stories that science is beginning to paint, the picture that it's beginning to paint for us in relation to how we got to where we are, the evolution of life. And with more and more information being gathered in very exciting ways, like with the landing of probes on comets or flybys of former planets, Pluto. These are great things, and while I don't deny the value of those, of course we'd all prefer if people wouldn't need the wow factor in order to be a little bit more critical in their thinking. But it does seem that there are more and more individuals. I see lots of YouTube channels whose only purpose it seems to be to try and explain science to people like me. I'm a scientist. I'm studying computer science, but my area of expertise is non-existent at the moment because I'm only in first year. But it will be still very, very narrow. So I still don't understand physics or chemistry or all these other things, but I do find them interesting. And so these channels are brilliant, and they seem to be done. Some are done by people who are studying science. Some are done by people just like ourselves who are interested in science. Unfortunately, of course, I'm looking at that from the perspective of someone who wants to look for it. So I don't know if this is actually what's happening more generally in the culture. But it would seem that podcasts and things like YouTube may be an antidote to the kind of, as you said, kind of media-oriented science is done in the way you think it is, binary, it's yes or no, and there's always two sides, and they're equally valid always, is actually now being countered, at least, even only in a small way, by people who are relatively more independent and who aren't producing the material for the sake of finance.
Yeah. There is sort of a double-edged sword to that as well, because while the alternative media, alternative internet media has certainly, I mean, if I take myself for an example, like I wouldn't really know half the stuff today that I know if it wasn't for the internet, because obviously I can just sit and research anything, and that's the great thing about just be able to be engaged in like self-learning, self-directed learning. But the problem is as well, it's also amplified like a lot of nonsense, like going back to like conspiracy theories like 9/11 and and
because you find more voices who support that idea, and so it buoys your belief in a particular. And then, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean, I was going to say about I used to also be a bit of a truther as well.
Oh, okay. Do you want to? Okay, so controversy. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that? So is a truther a particular thing, or
a truther is basically it's a phrase used by like sort of 9/11 conspiracy theorists who basically reject the official story of what happened in 9/11, which was Islamic fundamentalists basically flew planes into buildings. And so before I started my sort of skeptic journey, I basically did buy into a lot of conspiracy theories, which are now, well, actually no, sorry, not a lot of conspiracy theories. I did have a brief stint as a 9/11 conspiracy theorist, but I now reject that completely.
And is there one particular alternative theory, the other story, teach the controversy, or is there multiple ones, or is there one particular version that you at the time?
Well, I see what it was I I used to basically hang out with a bunch of stoners.
All right, okay.
So we used to.
Well, hopefully not too much of that has changed.
Yeah,
That's not a bad thing.
Yeah,
but.
so like we used to like just watch all these kind of mind-altering documentaries, like, and then so I used to kind of buy into that, and I was basically surrounded by people who also believed in it, and then see what happened was I started a humanities course, and so that was like sociology, history, and then that went forward to like philosophy and anthropology, and so one of the things that happened there was I actually learned probably for the first time about an actual balanced argument where you are hearing two sides, but comparing and contrasting them and using understanding the importance of sources, where information comes from. Whereas before, have you ever watched many conspiracy documentaries yourself? Or?
Not too many, no.
So conspiracy documentaries they're usually pretty self-righteous and overzealous and very clearly pointing in one direction, and they always have like ominous music in the background and like the real story of what happened on 9/11, that kind of stuff. So I kind of bought into that, but then obviously as you become a bit of a better critical thinker, you understand the importance of questioning where information comes from in the first place. So
it sounds like you actually for a moment you were describing Fox News, but anyway, so then you had. Yeah. So you reckon by being surrounded by these particular people, watching these kind of, and do you think the actual information with the conspiracy theories documentaries appealed to you, or was it just that it was? There was not what was being officially told, or
because I was always pretty anti-establishment, so I think a lot of this kind of propaganda that the American government might have done 9/11 probably did appeal to me a little bit. Right. Because I always am pretty skeptical of U.S. foreign policy and things of that nature. But one of the things as well that happened. So yeah, you're all right. So I was surrounded by people who had similar beliefs to me, and so in a way, it was almost like an ideological echo chamber where. You're almost compartmentalized by certain information that gets reinforced back to you, and that's how you're basically part of like a tribe, and that tribe follows a certain set of beliefs, and you're thinking, well, this must be true because these people are all pretty smart people. And then so what happened was whenever I started my Access Humanities course, I was actually surrounded people who had different beliefs to me, and
oh dear.
Yeah, exactly. So one of the things, so a lot of people, like for example, there was this girl who was a creationist, so that's one, and then there was another guy who was like big into like the royal family for some reason, and I used to basically kind of scoff at their beliefs, going, how could you believe that? And then one day I had this kind of like real profound moment of introspection where I kind of thought, what if I'm wrong? What if my entire belief system is just completely, because at the end of the day, I'm just one person out of 7 billion people. Like what makes my beliefs more credible than anybody else's, and how do I, why does someone like me understand this, yet people like say Noam Chomsky or Sam Harris or all these intellectuals who I sort of respected at the time, why is it that they don't buy into this, yet I for some reason, me, just some guy sitting in his living room watching documentaries,
get it.
Yeah,
you understand.
So that was like so there's a bit of like Socratic questioning going on there where I started like questioning my thought process. So one of the first things, there was a couple of things afterwards that happened. So I was watching like a BBC documentary, and it was basically BBC Conspiracy Files, and they had this part with because obviously one of the main theories of 9/11 is that the buildings all 3 buildings were like a controlled demolition. Mm-hmm. You know about that? Or?
Yeah. So actually, just to clarify, so the official story, which I think both of us generally buy into, is that they were planes crashed into the building by Islamic fundamentalists, and it happened the way that most people seem to think it happened. The one of the main truther ones is that, as you said, it was controlled demolition, and those demolitions were actually orchestrated by the US government in order to somebody within to promote the idea of a conflict, so that I guess arms companies could have a merry little war to test out their contracts. Excellent. Okay. So sorry, go ahead.
So I was watching this documentary, and they had this controlled demolition expert on, and he was saying, like, I think he held the record for like the biggest building ever demolished. It's like in the Guinness Book of Records or something like that. And he was saying, like, in order to...
That is actually a cool record to hold. Yeah. I really wish I had that, but that's pretty cool. Sorry, yeah.
But he was saying, like, he was basically asked a question, how is it that all 3 of these buildings got rigged without anybody noticing? Because in order to rig a building, it requires months and months of preparation, and You know, people knocking down walls and drilling holes and things, and you have miles and miles of cable, and you know, it just seems pretty unlikely that they could have pulled this off without anybody noticing anything out of the ordinary. So they put this forward to Richard Gage. Richard Gage is one of the main architects for 9/11 Truth, who basically says that it was brought down to controlled demolition. And they sort of asked him, so what's your explanation? You know, how do you think they could have done this without anybody noticing? And he said, well, maybe they were done when the buildings were erected in the 80s. And so I was kind of like, okay, so is that, you know, and you start to realize that was probably the first moment where I started realizing the sort of fanciful explanations. A lot of stuff like 9/11 Truth are put forward is stuff that seems, whenever you look at it from in a prima facie way, it sort of seems like it kind of makes sense, but whenever you really sit and think about the logistics of it, it just doesn't seem feasible. It's just really far-fetched explanations that just like don't even really make any sense half the time. And I mean, do you agree? Or
yeah. I don't know too many. I say I don't know too many conspiracy theories. I probably do.
Yeah.
But I mean, always when I looked at the X-Files, which is a conspiracy. Well, I mean, to many conspiracy theorists, it's probably a documentary series.
X-Files is a good program.
But I loved it. I thought it was a brilliant program. But I always more readily identified with Scully than Mulder. I was always, Scully, will you not believe him? Because look, we can see it. But actually, oddly enough, I always identified with Scully. But I knew little bits of it, like little bits of the whole confirmation bias. I whenever there was a hole, we'd explain it or whatever else. Yeah. But I always looked at that, as you were saying, you were kind of looking at the silly opinions of your creationist or royalist colleagues in college, with a little bit of, really, you believe that? I mean, I would have looked at you know, people who, I knew people who almost believed the X-Files, and yet, you know, I was believing in talking snakes and sky fairies who were telling people about how to live their lives. So it is always very easy for us to almost apply our cynical hat rather than our skeptic hat, most definitely at other people, and yet very, very seldom at ourselves. So I actually think when you describe that moment when you all of a sudden went, wait a minute, what makes me, the one person of 7 billion, so special? And then of course you went, well, look, people like Noam Chomsky or Sam Harris or others have studied it.
But I don't want to say, a lot of people might be listening saying that I'm appealing to authority there, but I'm just saying those are people who I just generally respected as rational people.
If they're smart and they're intelligent and they're putting time into it, and you know you're smart, but you think they may be smarter, and you know you'll put some time into it, but you're questioning anyway. In fact, I would argue that you're questioning your own authority, which is not a bad thing, which is a great thing to do. But the fact that you had, because you and I were talking about this, we're talking about how do we get people from the point of being in a particular mindset, trapped in a mindset, as our friend Matt has said, and not realising it. How do we get out of it? And we were saying, well, maybe we could talk about our own stories. So you seem to have a moment where that light bulb moment.
Sort of continuing on with, because there's actually more to the story. So the next thing after that, so that whole Richard Gage moment, you know, I think they were rigged in the 80s. That sort of... It didn't change my mind at that moment, but it certainly planted a seed of, okay, well, that doesn't really seem like a good explanation. But the next thing that happened was a few months after that happened, Osama bin Laden died. You know, and I noticed immediately straight away the conspiracy camp. Even not even a day had passed. The conspiracy theory camp.
Did he really die?
You know, or no, it wasn't. Or he died like 10 years ago or something. And this is all just a conspiracy to improve Obama's approval ratings, or
they were pretty low at the time.
It's there to, you know, it's there to basically get people away from more important issues. You know, it's there to distract people. You know, so I saw this happening, and then I started really thinking about conspiracy theories as a whole. Because have you noticed the way, like, near enough every major event in history has like a conspiracy to it? You know, like the JFK assassination, 9/11, the Sandy Hook shooting, the Boston bombing. All these different events seem to have conspiracy theories to them. And that's not to say, like, I do think there are real conspiracies. I don't want to sort of, but it's understanding a methodology like an analogy I always like to use is the search for extraterrestrial life. If you take, say, the recent thing about the Kepler, what do you call it?
Kepler 452b.
So there are people out there who are scientists who are searching for extraterrestrial life, but they're doing so in a way that's actually scientifically tenable. You know, they're seeing this planet that lives that's kind of similar to Earth in the sense that it's in a habitable zone near their star essentially, and as well as that, hypothetically, if they were able to send out radio waves within the past 1,400 years, we could potentially pick that up. I mean, I'm not saying that's necessarily going to happen, but my point is they're trying to find extraterrestrial life, but they're doing so in a way that's actually credible. But if you compare that to ufologists, they are also trying to find extraterrestrial life, but you know yourself.
Yeah,
it's just,
they're kind of divining it through locating Area 51.
Or, you know, have you heard of the Raelian movement? Or?
I have.
Yeah.
In fact, it was the Raelian movement that I was thinking of when I was telling you about. I had a couple of friends who believed in the X-Files almost as a documentary. I won't post anything to the Raelian movement if you really want to look it up. I think it's a cross between aliens and Jews, in fact, because I think Raelian is the Israelian.
Oh, right.
At least that's what I was told by this particular person a long time ago.
So you get what I'm saying? There's...
It's the methodology that's actually key here.
So, in regards to conspiracy theories, there are real conspiracies. You know, I'm trying to think of an example, like the Watergate thing, or you know, things of that nature. But they actually have some sort of credible evidence to back them up. Whereas conspiracy theory, with all these, like the 9/11 and the JFK one, I started really questioning their methodology, because I started thinking, you know, what's really the likelihood. You know, how competent really are the government? You know, the American government couldn't even keep a cum-stained dress secret between two people in the Oval Office. How could 9/11, how could thousands of people be on this, and yet nothing's come of it? So I started questioning that, and so that was like another major thing that happened. And then finally it came to the point where I started actually looking at the debunked side, and you start to realize that they just didn't actually have it. Like 9/11 truthers and conspiracy theorists in general, what they tend to do is they tend to have more negative evidence rather than positive evidence. You know what I mean by that?
Yeah. So usually with burden of proof, the person who's making the positive claim has to provide evidence to show that the claim is true, rather than providing some sort of negating evidence to show that an alternative claim might be false.
So 9/11 truthers, they would say things like, you know, why did this happen, or how did 12 people with box cutters, you know, hijack the planes, or why did Larry Silverstein say pull it? And they just ask questions, but they never actually put forward an actual hypothesis that could be tested and verified or rejected. I mean, like, to be an example, if you take something like the Pentagon, you've heard of the one about the Pentagon? Or
no, tell me about the
Pentagon. There's a theory that the Pentagon wasn't actually hit by a plane. It was basically a missile, or well, they think it's a missile because, and their sort of main evidence for this is the fact that they won't release the footage of the plane hitting the thing, and also apparently the guy who was flying the plane was a bad pilot, or you know, it's impossible he could have done this. But then the problem is like, okay, well, what's the positive evidence that it was a missile? And because you need, you know, what hypothesis can you put forward that supports your claim? Because it's, if we actually follow truthers to the kind of logical conclusion, what they're essentially saying is that you know, somebody hijacked a plane which they didn't use for some reason. It just disappeared into another reality, and then the CIA, the people who were on board the plane, they're just chilling out in the Caribbean somewhere, just haven't said anything. And then you have all the witnesses, you know, all like dozens of witnesses, you all say, yep, it was a plane. So, you know, are they just actors, or are they shills? Or, and then you have all the plane parts, and you know, there's what's the evidence that a missile actually hit the Pentagon? And that's kind of where they're lacking. They don't actually put forward anything, essentially. So that was the kind of the final straw of, okay, they don't actually have anything. They're just basically undermining the official story. They're basically chipping away at the official story with nothing, essentially. You know?
Yeah, you're just asking, you said, almost rhetorical questions. Yeah. And of course, I think that boils down to, again, we're back to the mindset, the thought process. It's a very different thought process when one is trying to present a case, whether it's scientific or legal. You have to follow burden of proof. You have to provide the information. You have to convince people who've never seen it before. Whereas if you're not really interested in actually what happened, just interested in denying what, as you said, deniers, this is why you call them, or why they are called denialists, is because their goal is actually to deny something rather than put something
well,
forth.
Their goal is, I think, they are conspiracy theorists, and essentially there's a very thin line between questioning things and just not believing things, and essentially that's kind of what their position is. They just see the government and the media and the scientific community, because that's to forget as well. There are certain, the whole thing about 9/11 is they've actually put forward scientific papers as well for the Twin Towers, but they never actually underwent any really serious peer review. Like the paper that it was actually published in was something called Bentham Publishing, which is an online journal, and it's been kind of widely criticized because somebody actually put a paper through it, and it was basically like something like 10 pages, and it was essentially a random essay generator.
Yeah,
like, it basically had a whole bunch of random...
I know this particular case. It was actually, in fact, I think it was potentially for a computer science part of it, which is not something. Well, it's something we were, as a community, we were proud of because we're able to create brilliant heuristics that can fool humans, but also not so good that it's so gobbledygooky that it could be accepted for that kind of thing. So, I mean, you're right. I mean, we're back to Occam's razor, aren't we?
Yeah.
We're back to, yes, we may have questions, there may be gaps, and it's important that we try to fill those gaps, but that doesn't mean you should reject everything else, and it certainly doesn't mean that the gaps are enough to open up completely alternative ideas with no other supporting evidence. We have to have a look at what evidence we do have, and as you said, if we start with evidence conclusion rather than conclusion, find the evidence. And
another thing as well is I kind of want to point out is whenever I changed my mind on 9/11 as well, I actually had this really emotional, like really uncomfortable cognitive dissonance moment where I kind of wanted to still believe in it, but I just saw all this conflicting evidence. So there was a part of me that was just clinging to it. And I think a part of it was probably, it was kind of my identity, because I spent like 8 months, like, you know, researching this, and
that's quite a bit of time,
and talking to people and probably going to parties and chewing their ear off about 9/11. So I almost had like an emotional investment in it, and so it almost felt like I just wasted. Like I actually look back at it and almost an embarrassment, to be honest. It's really kind of cringeworthy.
Well, yes. Well, there's you know, only a few of us who are, you know, who have spent almost our entire lives in religion. So, you know, I mean, I don't think I was ever into conspiracy theories. As I said, even when watching the X-Files, I realized that there was a lot of conspiracy stuff there, and I was a Star Trek fan at the time the X-Files was released, and Star Trek was very humanistic and very scientific, very pro-science in its outlook. And while I didn't even realise that that's what was affecting me, it affected me enough in that at that time I was a teenager, and I wouldn't say going through a renewance of my Catholic faith, but it was certainly... It was important to me at the time when most of the teenagers didn't care that much about it. Now, I wasn't throwing it in anybody's face, and I knew I was the weirdo teenager, but it was still important, and so I still had plenty of what is it? Schirmer calls them logic type compartments all over. So don't put yourself too down for eight months of conspiracy theory. I had an awful lot more of it, but I think. I'm impressed by that moment that you had, because I don't think I can't recall that moment that I had in relation to, as I said, if I wasn't interested, or if I wasn't into conspiracy theories, I was sort of into the religion that I was in. I mean, I was paying homage to it weekly right up until I was 24, but I don't think I had. No, there was definitely not one moment. It was little chips. Bit by bit. The first one I think the first one probably started when I started having conflict with being gay and the church's position on homosexuality. And that was about 93, 94. Then there was another one in 96, and I discussed this on a show before, to do with something learning about how certain religious facts in Islam came about and the culture at the time that was happening, and realising, they were connected. So a bit of Occam's razor was beginning to go, maybe it wasn't, you know, the winged horse deity, but actually just the culture of the time. And then bit by bit, I kind of realised I didn't agree with that. I don't definitely believe that. That's bollocks. And that was enough to make me go, okay, I don't know what I am, but I'm no longer what I used to think I was.
See, that's actually interesting to say that, because I almost think that belief systems are in a way, you know what a fractal is?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think belief systems are fractal because it's almost like strong beliefs are almost propped up by many small beliefs, and as those small beliefs get dismantled, then the bigger belief starts to become less credible in your mind. And because even when I changed my mind on 9/11 and certain other conspiracy theories I was into, it almost felt like you could almost automatically spot bullshit more. Like I probably have more of a bullshit detector now than when I did back then, because I
agree.
Because like it really, to me, it shows kind of the harm of having false beliefs, because if you're susceptible to being wrong about that, then what else could you be wrong about? You know, and then you tend to find conspiracy theorists or people who are into pseudoscience, they don't just believe one bad thing, they believe multiple things. So if you're into like alternative medicine, for example, you know, you believe, most people who are into alternative medicine also tend to believe that vaccines are bad or GMOs are bad, or they basically have this sort of appeal to nature about them, where they think everything that's natural is better and we shouldn't try to mess with that. But then, you know,
cancer,
measles are natural, and you know, whopping cough's natural.
Yeah, there's so many wonderful natural things that poisonous monkeys and volcanoes, they're also natural. I think you're right. I think there is a kind of reinforcement there. And it's something that I think we also, well, I consider myself to be a very much a part of an atheist community, and the good and the bad of being a part of any community, as you yourself were part of a truther community, is that we can get locked in ourselves, even with the best of intentions, even being aware of our biases and of this process, being emotional creatures first. We like community, and when we're part of it, we still react when our community is being attacked. We might attack back without maybe going, oh, actually there might have been something to that. So it is something that we have to be aware of ourselves. However, it does seem that communities that don't want to question do band together. And I think then that becomes very, very difficult to break that down, just at an individual level, because you'll always because in fact the cost, it's almost like a cost benefit analysis. The cost that you were beginning to realize of actually changing your mind is actually quite high. Because this community, the one that you used to belong to, that people do belong to at the moment, doesn't like the other community, as in the way that they think or the ideas that they think. And if I start moving towards those ideas, does that mean I'm moving away from my community? And I may be ostracized, and of course it happens.
There's actually a guy on YouTube who I'm actually friends with on Facebook, the guy called Charlie Veach, and he was a famous truther on YouTube. And he basically he actually changed his mind around about the same time I did, and he came out with a video, and he started just getting all these death threats and
death threats.
Well, and just people giving him just general abuse, and it just kind of goes to show, like,
because he's expressing a different idea.
Yeah, essentially.
That's
because what it was is he actually went on a BBC. Because he was like a prominent truther, he went on a BBC show about 9/11 conspiracy. He's basically trying to change their mind by introducing them to experts. And so the conspiracy theorists, in true conspiracy theorists, fashion, was like, oh, he must have been paid off by the BBC, because how else would he? I mean, it's so obvious.
He couldn't possibly change his mind. And do you know what? I saw something. It's a meme posted. I don't know it. No, I'm sorry, Phil, if you posted this. If you did, then apologies for stealing it from you. And if you didn't, then maybe you've seen it, and I'd like to hear your opinion on it. I think it's a black and white picture, and I think it's a picture of scientists probably in the 70s or 60s or whatever. And it is essentially an anti-conspiracy theorist meme. It's basically saying, if you really think that all of these scientists and scientists all around the world have all been bribed successfully to keep quiet about cures that could cure members of their own family that have been affected, and then maybe that says something about your own ethics. I mean, memes are hit and miss, but it is an interesting perspective, because that seems to be a common retort. Oh, who you're working for, you must, and it is a good question to ask. That's not a bad question to ask. As you said, it's not as if conspiracy theories don't happen. They do, but it seems to be, as you said, the rhetorical question: who do you work for? Who paid you to say that? What's your vested interest? But it seems to be an interesting thought on that. It's just, well, look, now you have to deal with the vested interests of millions of scientists who are working in this area.
Well, the thing is,
but
vested interests. The problem is as well is vested interests are often applicable to both sides. Like once again, coming back to the alternative medicine. Okay, big pharma, they're not perfect. Big pharma there is a lot of corrupt stuff, but then the alternative
and they make money from medicine.
They make medicine, but then so do the alternative medicine. You know, I always laugh whenever I see all these naturalnews.com. It's like, big pharma's corrupt, don't get this. But then buy our natural pills, our natural supplements that are completely untested and unverified.
And cost a lot less to produce and do nothing. And I don't know what the profit, the return on investment of those kind of things are, but I imagine, given the research that has to go into actual medicine, is actually quite considerable. And of course, I mean, we're talking about these kind of things, and like some people go, well, what the hell, it doesn't really matter, let people believe what they want to believe. But of course there's very, very, very serious consequences to promoting this kind of thing, from the most recent case we've seen in the States with vaccines. And if people aren't aware of this, there has been there has been a push against vaccines from a number of different groups. In particular, one of the most vocal is one that has been for a long time attempting to link autism, the rise in autism, or the apparent rise in autism, with vaccinations, and to the point where large enough groups of people, communities within large communities, have decided not to have children vaccine, and we've now seen a return of diseases that had been wiped out, or more or less wiped out, occurring in first world countries, in particular in America, prompting Governor Jerry Brown, I think it is, of California, to sign into law a bill that basically made it mandatory that if you were going to bring your child into the public school system, you had to have proof that they were vaccinated. I think it's their equivalent of MMR vaccine. And there has been controversy. Controversy could mean anything, but there has been considerable resistance against this. The most notable that I had seen was Jim Carrey.
Oh yeah,
and the more and more I read, the more and more I go. The Mask was brilliant, and then it all ended.
I know that the 7-year-old me is just really disappointed, because I did love. I used to watch Ace Ventura when I was a kid.
Ace Ventura, brilliant.
And it's just
the first one. The second one, we'll talk about that later. I want to talk about that with my transgender friends when we get to that particular conversation. But yeah, he seems to have gone off the rails completely. His response was, this is terrifying that that people are being forced to do this, And again, Jim Carrey is not an expert in any of these things.
Or Jenny McCarthy.
Or Jenny McCarthy, of course, yeah. Jim Carrey, I'm sure, is an expert in amazingly funny faces, exactly. But he's not an expert in these kind of things. And again, it's back to methodology, but it seems that they employ similar tactics to, as you and I were discussing earlier on, in relation to the marriage equality referendum that occurred here in the Republic a couple of months ago. When you don't seem to either have the expertise or the data to back up your claim, then sometimes it's enough just to throw out confusion. And I know that he was throwing out things about particular metals, and even though there was no evidence to show that these particular, I think it was particular
mercury.
Metal, it was mercury, but I thought there was something else. There was, or it might have been
thimerosal, or
thimerosal. And my understanding is that had been taken out, even though there was no evidence that this was a problem. They took it out because
I mean, the mercury, from my understanding, it's a really trace amount that's not going to do. I mean, to put it in perspective, there's more mercury in a tuna fish tin, basically.
Right.
So it's like. It just seems like it's just like it's understanding the concept of the fact that it's a traceable. I mean, if you take something like, say, if we go into a swimming pool, for example, swimming pools full of chlorine. Yeah. Chlorine was used as a weapon in like World War I or II for basically, poisoning people, basically. I mean, but yet you feel comfortable putting your kid in the swimming pool because we understand.
It's the quantity. It's with all poisons, it's the quantity that makes it a poison. And so I didn't realize that actually the amount of mercury that used to be in some of these vaccines anyway was so I didn't realize smaller than the amount that would be in a tuna fish tin.
Something like that.
So I suppose, I mean, they were red herring. Sorry, I had to do that. They were red herring arguments anyway, but even more so now, as you've explained that. So we had that, and we had Sorry, yes. So I was talking about the consequences of this. So the consequences have been that some of these diseases have returned. On other scales, and I know a couple of people to whom this has happened, people have died perhaps earlier, or perhaps have died who may never have had to die, or certainly at the time, as a result of choosing alternative medicine over, or what they call complementary medicine, which is just a term I've recently learned. Alternative medicine over medicine. As a result, or evidence-based medicine, as a friend of mine who is in evidence-based medicine likes to highlight. And as a result of this, they've died. This has been a very serious consequences. Their life has been shortened because of choosing to value or to not value evidence-based thinking.
Yeah.
And of course, the most serious one is it seems that we're prolonging decision-making in relation to our actions on climate change or global warming, not exclusively because of the push back by global warming denialists, but that's certainly having an impact. It's slowing efforts down to drive forward government policy, let's say, because it's probably going to have to start, or it needs to be guided or leaded through there. So these impacts are very serious. It's not just let them have their belief, it's let them have their belief, and the consequences are actually now life-threatening to us all at some point. Goodness, that sounded very, very dramatic, but it is actually that serious. So I don't know if you think are they just innocent? Is it good enough for us just to leave them alone and let them believe what they want to believe? Should we be trying to change?
Well, I think
the mindset.
I think, you know, in general, I think like not being rational or being a skeptic, in a way, I find it really disempowering in a way, because if you aren't able to sort of tell a difference between what's bullshit and what's not bullshit, essentially that leaves you open to any snake oil salesman that comes along. And I mean, I was actually reading this book I've got in front of me called Bad Science by Ben Goldacre, and he was basically he had a really good term called what was it called? The privatization of common sense, where essentially you can get people to do pretty common sense things, but for really irrational reasons. Like, for example, he brought up the example of something called brain gym. Have you heard of this before?
Brain gym? No.
It's basically like, it's this thing that kids do in school nowadays. Apparently they essentially do all these things during they take these intervals during class, and then they do all these like weird exercises where they put the fingers together, and then that apparently boosts electricity to the brain or something. I don't know, just a whole bunch of crap anyway. But he made the point that like there's a lot of common sense in that as well, because it's good for kids to kind of take break or to take, you know, to have breathing exercises and to take breaks and have a glass of water and stuff like that. But then someone somewhere is just making money out of that, essentially. You know, you're basically, there's no real reason why people couldn't have just got together and did that themselves without some alleged expert coming in and saying, oh, actually, you know, if you do this boosts concentration of the brain. And
here buy these tools from us that we happen to sell that support it.
And it just comes back to what I was saying earlier about, like, you know, once you have that kind of, you know, things like that start out small and we think, oh, well, that's harmless. But then coming back to what I was saying earlier about belief systems in general, we know if you're not able to tell a difference between, you know, bad science and good science, then essentially, like I said earlier, that just leaves you susceptible to buying into these more dangerous beliefs, whether that be vaccination or the vaccination conspiracy, or just conspiracy theories in general. Because if you think it's, say, coming back to the whole 9/11 thing or the global warming thing, if you're spending your time trying to figure out who killed JFK, then that's time that you're not spending, you know, doing something about climate change or something that's just more important politically. You know, you're if you think of the amount of people that go out on 9/11 each year and go out and spreading this information all over the place, like that's just time wasted essentially that could have been put towards something else. And that's why I feel really passionate about it, because I feel like I wasted a lot of time on that kind of stuff. I'm sure you probably did as well, maybe to an extent. Or
yeah. Well, I remember. Sorry, I don't want to interrupt your flow, but I remember a friend saying, and at this point I had definitely stopped identifying as both a Christian or a Catholic.
Yeah.
And it's just something she said, and initially I accepted it, and then I went, oh no, wait a minute. And what she said was, this has to be true. She was a fundamentalist believing Christian. That's how she described herself. And she said this has to be true, because if it isn't, then we've wasted the last 2 millennia.
Exactly, yeah.
And initially I went, yeah, and I thought about it when I went home, and I was like, no, actually, that's not a good enough reason to assume that this will be true. And I tried to explain to her the next time I saw her that I didn't think it was a complete waste in that beautiful buildings, beautiful music, or whatever else, and it's part of our culture and it's there. But yes, I do agree, and I think this is why I also feel that challenging people on this, this is why I agree with Richard Dawkins that we can't allow the moderates away with anything either. First of all, we have to be absolutely egalitarian in our application of questioning people, and there's no reason why we should only focus on the people who are excessively aggressive in their beliefs, and we have to do it we have to do it towards beliefs as opposed to people. So I think it's the same problem here with as you were saying, if we allow the little things with fingers and brain training, or that kind of brain gym, go unchallenged, then it can build up to bigger.
Yeah, and the thing is, as well, a lot of the conspiracy stuff as well, you know, a lot of people, we have to understand, a lot of people think they have good intentions. That's a thing, but good intentions don't necessarily compensate for destructive actions. And the thing about a lot of the conspiracy stuff is, a lot of people who tend to promote them also tend to promote very dangerous ideas. And the thought that comes to my mind, although it's a pretty extreme thought, is, you know, late Weimar Germany. You know, if you think it's a lot of people in Germany were, you know, extreme hyperinflation, about like 6 million people were unemployed, and they just, you know, they were just sitting ducks essentially. They were saying, you know, why is this happening? You know, why is everything going to shit? And then nobody gave them an answer, or nobody tried to direct them towards an answer. And then the Nazis came along and they gave them an answer, and it was a shit answer, but it was an answer nonetheless. And then that's why we see, even in places like America, you know, in America you have stuff like the Tea Party, who are basically, you know, they're basically being, you know, but coming back to what I was saying earlier about AstroTurf movements, a lot of the stuff within the Tea Party movement is all AstroTurf. It's basically companies that are given the illusion that they're, you know, fighting big government and Obama, but in actual fact they're pushing, you know, very far right interests. And essentially, and that goes for the global warming stuff as well, because obviously hard right libertarians are all pretty much anti-global warming, mainly for economic reasons. And it's also the same here in the United Kingdom. Obviously you have like political parties like UKIP, who they're very anti-global warming, and even just silly things as well. Like a lot of people want to bring homeopathy, or no, sorry, not even sillier than that. It's like, it's actually like they think they see value in things like horoscopes and shit, you know. So it just, you know, it's just all
Carl Sagan is spitting in his grave.
So the problem is, well, it's not just that, it's coming back to my original thing. People may have good intentions, but there has to be some sort of rational thought in there. You know, rational thought is what, you know, basically, you know, it separates a successful movement towards progressive change rather than an irrational mob rule who are basically just moving towards positions that are antithetical to actual positive change. You know,
so I mean, it's difficult to try and to cut through that, because of course most of this is culturally bound.
And sorry, it comes back to what we were saying earlier as well. It's like you sort of hate being the skeptic douche that has to. I mean, I meet people in my daily life who have certain beliefs, and I feel almost quite respectful towards. I mean, if they engage me in conversation, I'll maybe give my opinion, but whenever they propagate falsehoods, you know, just in general, you don't really want to be that dick that has to say, well, actually, no, that's wrong. Actually, that's a myth. No, that paper hasn't been peer reviewed, because you just feel like, you know, you're just being this guy who, and that's the thing as well, because a lot of people think that you're being arrogant as well. I don't know if that's a term that you've you've come across.
I have that has been thrown at me. Yes, although it may be warranted in some circumstances. But yes, I think they probably do go know it all. Certainly,
exactly,
But and as you and I were discussing earlier, I feel torn on this, because, like you, I want to positively affect change, and I understand that can only be done if the mindset is in some way prodded, at least, if not. I mean, we can't force a change, but we can encourage it. But when we do that socially, we become a bit pariah-like, and the human part of me just wants to interact with people. And so I suppose there's I've referred to him a few times, Seth Andrews, who does a podcast called The Thinking Atheist. I always like to promote it because it's a great podcast. He's an American, former Christian, lives in Oklahoma. He has this phrase where he says you have to pick your battles. So he would argue that if you want to have a conversation about atheism, you don't do it at a funeral of a religious person or a religious funeral, because first of all, most people are not going to be interested in it. But he also, like us, gets frustrated because then he's at a normal gathering in a normal situation, in work, in wherever. For him, quite often it's family gatherings, and people start spouting this, and he's got his bullshit detector is all alarms, and it's kind of going, no, check that, where's the facts, and blah, in his mind.
Yeah.
And he's tired now of actually being the douche, but he's also not that happy about sitting silent and listening to it. Mm-hmm. So he hasn't got an answer. There's no answer for this. Sorry, people are waiting for the answer. Right now, I think the last time he talked about it, he just said he limits his exposure to these people to about 15 minutes and finds the cool uncle or aunt or cousin or whatever in the room who actually understands what he's going through and spends the rest of the time with them. So, which is a little depressing, because I do think we do need to change the culture. Maybe what needs to happen, we can have our true grassroots approach to this, but actually maybe what needs to happen is we need to show more examples of how how critical thinking, which is essentially what all of this is, works, and how the others don't. And just keep promoting that message. Perhaps slowly but surely it'll filter down from the top, and maybe little bits from the ground up as well, and it might meet in the middle. So I don't know what else we could do. That's my answer to it anyway. So I'm actually hoping. I'll throw something out now. I've been thinking about this idea for a while. I don't know if I discussed this idea with you before, but it's called. So this is our podcast, Freethought Friday. I just, on the whole Freethought frame, I have been thinking about setting up an organisation called Freethought Fellowship, which sounds like a religion and a cult, but it isn't. But that's exactly what someone running a cult would say. The purpose of this organisation, I hope, will be three purposes. One is actually to provide a grassroots community for atheists, skeptics, humanists and freethinkers. And enable them to come together on a weekly basis, and I'm working on how that might manifest. The second one will be to promote the value set of the scientific method at the local community. Now, initially it's going to be talking to the converted, to use a religious term, but the hope would be actually that new members of the community who may be kind of thinking about this kind of stuff might be able to come and learn from the rest of us, and we'll learn from each other. And then the third one is to enable that community, the community of freethinkers, skeptics, humanists and atheists, to engage in social justice causes. So this is sounding very much like a church, and if it sounds like a church, that's because it is indeed based on some of the more successful aspects of it. But the reason why I think this is essential is because I look at organisations like Atheist Ireland, of which I'm a member, and I know there's an Atheist NI, and there's other organisations, the British Humanist Association, very, very active organisation. But what we don't do as skeptics and free thinkers is we don't proselytise, and that's okay. Because as in, we don't want to preach dogma. We don't want to preach dogma. Yeah. But unfortunately, we do have to tell our story. And we do have to tell our story at a local level, as much as we have to tell it at a higher level. Because the change has to come there, and people have to see that change being beneficial for their daily lives. And you've just told a very, very interesting story, and a convincing story in relation to how the change of moving towards a critical mindset saved you from wasting more time.
Yeah.
And I think that's, and that is a win. That's definitely a win. And it eventually, saved me, well, I hope saved me more time. Maybe I'm spending too much time on YouTube. So I think this is essential. I don't think any organisation does it. It may be that no organisation does it because others have tried and failed and it won't work, but that's fine. I don't mind trying it again and seeing if we can figure out why the others didn't work. But I actually do think it's very important. And I actually think long term, this is probably, I was going to say the only way. I don't know if it's the only way, but I do actually think it's one of the ways of making it happen. I think if we can get people coming together, and if the larger community can see the smaller community within it who have come together on the basis of valuing these things like burden of proof and the scientific method, but are also ordinary people doing ordinary things, doing all the good things that they expect the religious just to be doing, then it's a bit of PR as well as a bit of learning. What it can't be, of course, is dogmatic. That's the danger. But I think it's possible to ride that thin line and make sure you don't fall over into a dogmatic model, but at the same time we have to promote. You can still get people to test it, unlike with a religion where they go, well, you just need to believe it and you don't believe it, you're out. We can still get people to test it.
I mean, obviously the difference between a religion is like a religion generally minimizes criticism in the sense that it's looking to sort of propagate a certain ideological inertia essentially, and even if you look at, say, more extreme, like stuff like Scientology or maybe even Mormonism, maybe, or more just things like that, or just general cults, they tend to essentially banish anybody that questions the official narrative, basically just to minimize criticism. Whereas, obviously, with skepticism, our main thing is falsification. We're actually trying to say, look, prove us wrong, and we're looking at, and in a way, coming back to what I was saying about arrogance, that actually makes us a lot more open-minded, because closed-minded would be like a cult, where you are just, this is what the truth is, and anybody that gets through to this, anybody that criticizes this must just be brainwashed. Or whereas scientific skepticism is basically born out of falsification, and trying to arrive at something. We can obviously never arrive at an absolute truth, but we can arrive at provisional truths. Ever
closer approximations to truth, as Feynman put it. Yeah. I like that. I've heard that term recently before, I think from Neil deGrasse Tyson, provisional truths. It's actually a great phrase. So, So I hope to... I'll talk to this audience about it maybe next, a little bit more in the next podcast. But anyway, I think that might be... That's going to be my attempt to try and do this. I don't know if it'll work. It may fall flat on its face. But I'm happy to try and be wrong than not try at all. So I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to talk about, but...
Well, no.
You're good with that? Okay.
Pretty good conversation.
I think we've covered quite a bit. I'm going to put, as I was going to say as always, but as often as I can, I try to put links with our podcasts to show some of the stuff we talked about. And as always... on anything that we may be wrong, or you think we're wrong, or you just disagree, we always welcome people's opinions or whatever. So you can tell us on Facebook, or you can tell us at freethinkers@freethoughtfriday.com. I think I've forgotten our email address, but you can post on Facebook and let us know your questions. But thank you very much, Phil, for talking to us today. And myself and Rob will be back hopefully in the next couple of weeks with another episode. So thanks very much, and we'll talk to you again soon.
What this looks like imprisonment. What's worse is that the prisoners don't know that they're prisoners, even defend the tactics that they used to imprison them. A conquered mind trying to conquer other minds, selling out here. I'll show you what this looks like imprisonment. What's worse is that the prisoners don't know that they're prisoners.